Paul is the VP of Hydrogen at Shell, and he's going to tell us about the latest insights around what's happening around the world around hydrogen. There's a lot happening, and things are moving quite fast. So great to have you, Paul. I'm going to start with demand. We all know that we have to activate demand and ensure that supply and demand collaborate together. You have a lot of conversations with the demand centers. Great to hear. What's the latest that is happening in this space?
Yes, it is all about connecting that demand to the emerging hydrogen kind of supply system. And in Shell, we believe in the Powering Progress strategy that it is important to start from the customer backwards. So understanding what that demand looks like, the customer's willingness to pay, but also their switching cost. And I would say there's roughly 3 sectors that we're most excited about from all the conversations that myself and my team are having at the moment. One is the obvious one, right? It's the current use of hydrogen as a feedstock and backing out as much of the gray hydrogen that you produce today. So you're looking at petrochemicals, fertilizer in particular, as those 2 sectors where hydrogen is feedstock. And to just give you an idea of the size of the challenge, that's 94, 95 million tons of hydrogen already, of which less than, we heard it from Bart, less than 1% of that is clean hydrogen. Yeah. So that's a pretty sizable chunk to start with. The second sector on heavy industry that almost took us by surprise is steel making. So when we started this journey around sector by sector, understanding that yes, the energy transition will play out in a different way, at a different pace in different parts, but sectors will have things in common. A steel mill has many different decarbonization options. Could look at CCS, could look at biomass to replace the coal, or could look at hydrogen. And I think there we see almost a consensus that direct reduction of iron using hydrogen is the preferred pathway for decarbonization. So steel is probably the next big sector. And then the heavy road transport. All those sectors that are hard to electrify directly. I was really pleased that we heard a bit more news around AFIR, so the European kind of network that also includes every 200 kilometers a hydrogen station. So we believe there will be a mix there of electrification of demand and hydrogen. But those 3 sectors, and especially the combination of these 3 that we'll get to when we talk about hubs, is what really excites us.
Yeah. And within these 3 sectors, we all hear about the need for new business models, new ways, innovative ways of either creating products or going to the market. Any thoughts? Have you seen new business models that you like, or are you working on some exciting ideas?
Yeah, I think business model innovation is almost as important or equally important as the technology that sits behind all of this. And I'm going to take an example that we found in the sustainable aviation fuel sector, initiative called Avelia. Because our insight was that it was very hard to aggregate the demand. A lot of airlines were asking for sustainable aviation fuel, but couldn't really look at an end-to-end business model. And then we recognized that their customers, so the flying public, and especially people who travel on business travel, were really the ultimate end customers that could drive voluntary demand ahead of mandates coming into play. So Avelia creates that platform. It allows aggregation of that demand and really pulls through the need and the impulse for building more SAF for those customers. And in the 2 sectors I just mentioned, in steel and in heavy goods transport, you can look at similar business models. So you could think about green steel being driven by the need for the automotive industry and consumers willing to pay a little bit more for their vehicle being lower carbon in the production of the vehicle itself. So that you spread that green steel premium, if you like, within the value chain. So you're going B to B to C almost in that sense. And the same is true for activating the demand for hydrogen trucks, where I would sit in a conversation with DHL, and DHL would say, that's great that you've got a hydrogen truck, but we actually contract our shippers, and the shippers are actually doing that on behalf of companies that are distributing, a famous beer brand, and you need to talk to those guys because they might well be willing to pay a premium for the decarbonization of that chain. And these new business models need to be built and explored, and especially for the early adopters. That's how we can unlock the early value chains.
Yeah. And I think also one of the models that I think you're working on is the idea of trucking as a service as well, how you can help the sector, right? You own the truck, you lend it out, and this is to help essentially the sector because the TCO of a hydrogen truck is essentially more expensive, right?
Exactly. So I think in the initial phases, it's all about taking on risk in different pieces and making it easy for the customer to switch ahead of all the incentives falling into place.
Yeah. Well, you spoke about natural demand or green premiums. Regulation is also important and policies. I'm sure you also have a lot of discussions around policy. What do you see being something exciting happening in the space, and what are your predictions?
Yeah, and I think regulation almost is a customer in its own right. So maybe it's a B to G to B to whatever it is. You can think of all kinds of the alphabet. Yeah. When I came into this job, 2019, there was only one country that had a stated hydrogen policy, which was Japan. Yeah. And they had a series of incentives, and METI was really weighing in. Now we have, over 50 countries that have a stated policy. We have regional policies. And there's almost an arms race now going on with the American incentives being put in play. What does that mean for Europe? How does it play into industrial strategy? But I think there are kind of three things that policy has to get right. It's the balance between carrot or stick. So actually understanding where do you push and where do you provide incentives. And make sure that those incentives don't only cover capital cost, because there's a lot more risk that needs to be covered. It's the balance between supply and demand incentives. So yes, you can have an approach where you're just stimulating so much hydrogen coming to the market that all the use cases will fall into play. But it's unlikely because there's so much switching cost at the other end. Yeah. So the balance supply and demand is important. And I think then certainty. You need policies that survive at least 3 consecutive governments. You need at least a 10-year period where this all makes sense. So if you got the carrot stick, the supply demand and the longevity right, and it also supports not just individual projects, but the infrastructure that needs to happen, then I think you have a coherent set of policies that can really unlock the value chain. If one of these things is missing, it's very hard for any project to be investable.
And maybe also related to the policy side, we keep hearing still about the colors of hydrogen, right? And essentially the pathways of hydrogen. You hear the blue, the green. But there is now a discussion around, should we focus more on carbon intensity? And we even hear the IEA might issue a report on that very soon. What are your thoughts on that? How will the pathways look like in the next years?
Yeah, I think it's so funny. My daughter overheard me on one of these talks, and I was talking about green and blue and pink and all that. Said, "Dad, what are you doing? Are you building rainbows? I thought you were doing hydrogen, right?" And I think so. It's great to have simple labels, but everybody in this room knows that it's about carbon intensity, and having clear outlined rules that don't just work in one geography, but also if we think about the international trade of hydrogen long term, it needs to work. It needs to be simple. It needs to be unchallengeable, if you like. But it also needs to be implementable, if you like. And there are good examples out there. I think we're not that far off from actually setting individual levels, but we have to stop the debate around the taxonomy or the color coding of the hydrogen, because it's really holding back individual investments, because you don't know whether you're going to meet the threshold, or you don't know whether your project will be eligible to kind of be pulled into places like Europe where there's incentives in play. One school of thought is that because the incentives in the US are so phenomenal, that by default will start to set the global standard for where the different thresholds will sit. And there's some consensus around that view forming.
Okay. Well, time is running out, but I have to talk about Hydrogen Holland 1, because it's a great success. One of the very few projects around the world to pass the FID, one of the largest green hydrogen projects. What are the main learnings from this project? How did you make it happen?
The main learnings are that although it's a relatively modest capital investment, it attracts more attention from our executive committee and the board than any other project that they... So if you wanted to get exposure and meet senior people in your company, doing a hydrogen project is a really good way of doing that. Don't expect all of the reviews to be favorable. But all joking aside, I think it is a foundational project. I think we learned probably 3 things from it. Is that if you want to get a project like that approved, it does help to be de-risked on both sides of the project. So because we had our own wind farm asset that we could secure the super duper compliant additional green electrons to go into the asset. Yeah. It also helps to be integrated on the energy and chemical park on the other side with a very flexible asset in our Rotterdam petrochemical complex, which is self-sufficient in hydrogen today, but it could also easily absorb the 200 megawatts. So first learning is it helps to be integrated, right? And that's an important play. The second piece is that it's also good sometimes to be bold. So one of the, because the enabling infrastructure will not happen if there's only one project. And we have to be modest here and saying, Holland Hydrogen 1, we took FID also to send a signal of confidence to the market so that other projects could materialize. So on that same conversion park on the Maasvlakte, we're looking forward to get some neighbors for HH1. So it's good to be integrated, but it's also good not to be alone in that space. And the third bit is actually that creating the future value for it and proving the business model is equally important as actually the technical maturation of the project. So we'll have all kinds of challenges in building the assets, making sure the technology works, making sure that everything is done safely. But at the end of the day, it's also about understanding how this asset in the future will make money and how the end-to-end value chain actually allows not just the decarbonization of the asset, but also looking at the future business models that it underpins.
Okay. All right, I think we have a minute left. Maybe let's pick a question. What hydrogen carrier technology are you focusing on? This is a very big question, of course.
Yeah, so when I came into the role, I was very pleased that we had already started a very bold move in terms of liquid hydrogen shipping, between Australia and Japan in a consortium with Japanese partners and, very much sponsored and encouraged by the Japanese government. So liquefaction of hydrogen is still one of the key carriers that we look at. We also now understand a lot more about the challenges of doing that. We're certainly not dismissing ammonia or other intermediates. And in fact, we're looking at a project in Oman today that, together with Alicia, would look at ammonia as one of the energy vectors. Every time we do a calculation, the end-to-end kind of cost and the round-trip efficiency roughly comes out the same, which means for me as an engineer, that means more work needs to be done before you can actually make a decision.
Yeah, okay. Great. Well, we're out of time, and just really wanted to thank you, Paul. This went really fast, but thank you very much. And it's great to see how much you're progressing, and hopefully this gives confidence as well that we can't pass FID and we can't have projects into the future.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rick.